Hello, and welcome back to the Outdoor Minimalist Podcast. I'm your host, Meg Carney, an outdoor and environmental writer and author of the book Outdoor Minimalist: Wasteless Hiking, Camping, and Backpacking. The Outdoor Minimalist Podcast has a goal to give listeners actionable ways to waste less hiking, camping, backpacking, and more during every step of their process. Your impact outdoors starts long before you hit the trail and goes beyond leave no trace ethics. You'll learn how to identify sustainable outdoor brands, how to ask hard questions regarding sustainability, and begin to shift and evolve your mindset to integrate minimalism into all of your outdoor pursuits. In episode 71 of the Outdoor Minimalist Podcast, I am talking about a few of the differences between a linear, reuse, and circular economy. I've had several guests on the show that have discussed these concepts to some degree, but I wanted to combine the ideas down into one short and sweet episode to hopefully make them a little bit easier to digest. Before we get to all of that, though, I do want to make a few quick announcements. First, as many of you know, at the beginning of January, we launched an email newsletter that comes out every Monday, the same day as our podcast episode release. So if you want to stay up to date on the latest from the Outdoor Minimalist team, you can subscribe to that newsletter by heading over to theoutdoorminimalist.com. And if you already get the newsletter, thank you for subscribing, but you'll also know that I've been talking about the launch of our YouTube channel for a couple of weeks, and the time has finally come. The Outdoor Minimalist YouTube channel goes live this Wednesday, February 1st. There is, of course, going to be a lot of room for learning here. But for now, we plan to share podcast episodes. All the old ones are going to be up there as well. And we'll also be uploading videos that have some lifestyle vlog type content, gear reviews that have more of a durability and environmentally type focused review aspect. Of course, I'll talk about functionality as well, but I want to kind of put a new outdoor minimalist type spin onto that type of content, and more about how to integrate outdoor minimalism into your daily and recreational life as well. I'm really looking forward to sharing these concepts that we're also passionate about in a new way, and I hope you'll join us. Okay, enough about that. Let's get to the show. So, in writing the Outdoor Minimalist book, the primary focus was on individual ways that we can make positive changes to our habits when we are recreating outside. Now, that wasn't the only focus because, in my opinion, the book's concepts and ideas can also be applied to larger scale production and outdoor businesses in several different ways. But because many listeners are business owners and also are individuals, then I kind of wanted to talk about the limits of individual change in any type of zero waste, minimalist, environmental movement. I feel like I've mentioned before on the podcast many different times, and some of my guests have as well, is that the climate crisis in and out of the outdoor industry is a systemic issue that goes beyond ourselves. So beyond the personal boycotts, personal changes, reducing our waste, then we need to be thinking bigger picture. So I still want to focus on consumerism because that's the main topic, but we won't be focusing on individual consumerism. Instead, we're going to look at our collective consumer systems. We're going to look at how our products get from extraction from the earth to the stores, and then eventually how those get into our lives and eventually end up in the dump. So first and foremost, I just want to get this out of the way. This isn't a waste management problem. This is a waste production problem. So when we look at the issue of waste from the management standpoint, we're missing a more significant issue at hand, and that is that we're producing too much waste to begin with. It's not a question of if we're innovative enough to manage that waste once it gets to us. So yes, our recycling system isn't perfect, but essentially what I'm saying is that if we didn't have as much waste, we wouldn't need as many innovations in recycling. And I don't want to discount any of the awesome programs that many municipalities do have in place for recycling and composting, but this can't answer our addiction to waste. I also want to clarify that I'm not saying that these systems should not be improved or implemented more strategically throughout all cities and nations, but tackling an issue as big as waste, we should first look at the source. Let's talk about our current linear production model. And as you can imagine in your mind, a linear system makes basically a direct line. So it feeds our desire for consumer goods that are cheap, easy, and instant. The problem is that the Earth's resources are finite, and a linear system treats them as if they're infinite. So with a linear system, we are taking more resources than we can give back. The linear system consists of 5 major components: extraction, production, distribution, consumption, and disposal. So I'm going to break each of those categories down and kind of discuss what each one means, because it will relate to the other types of production models that I'm going to talk about later in this episode. So first, extraction. For a linear economy or a linear production model to survive, we need an infinite supply of resources. And the first step in the current system is to take, exploit, or destroy the natural resources we do have without any intention to return anything useful. So just kind of take what we want and assume that we can always take. As human animals, we are a natural part of this ecosystem on Earth, and we have always used natural resources. We need them to survive. The difference now is that we're no longer living in a hunter-gatherer society of any kind. Humans, for the most part, lived within the limits of their immediate resources up until the Industrial Revolution. And since then, the human population just has continued to grow, which only increases our demand for those resources, such as fossil fuels, metals, minerals, and biomass. To give you a picture, on average, every person on the planet consumes more than 11 tons of natural resources per year. And people in rich countries consume 10 times more per person than those in poorer countries. That's almost 90 billion tons of resources taken and not replenished each year. As this extraction rate continues to grow, it's expected that wealthier nations like the United States, China, and some countries in Europe will need to cut their consumption by up to 90%, or we will run out. So that was extraction. Let's move on to production and distribution. Once the resource has been taken from the earth, it moves into production. One thing that must be mentioned is that much of the extraction and production processes happen in impoverished nations. And as consumers, we're kind of left in the dark about this. I think more awareness is starting to be focused on the production process of our goods. And in my life, I have started to direct more of my attention towards how much money I'm spending and where and how I'm spending it on certain products by analyzing where those products are being produced. But the issue is that in our current extraction and production process, the exploitation of the earth and other humans is essentially crucial to making affordable products for, wealthier nations. So let's talk about how the production of certain consumer goods actually happens. So the natural resources are extracted and then processed into something new, which uses energy, other resources, chemicals, and oftentimes synthetics. One specific product example that I think is really easy to highlight kind of this process is electronics. We use electronics in our daily lives. I'm using it right now. I'm talking into an electronic microphone that's on a computer with my phone next to me. That's a lot of electronics just within arm's reach. And there's tons of other various electronics that I use in my home daily. In the writing of the Outdoor Minimalist book, unfortunately, I didn't talk a ton about electronics, which I think is maybe why I want to talk about it here. But something that is interesting for me to consider is all the different raw materials required to make one electronic item. And then I started thinking about how often these things need to be replaced before they become obsolete. Many companies actually specially design their products, specifically electronics, to have this type of planned obsolescence and essentially to be designed to be thrown away. They can exploit low-wage workers in third world countries to produce products so that production prices are low. And then to sell those products each year, they create new systems that can only be updated when we buy an entirely new product. We don't often have the option to repair or replace specific parts of our electronics. And if we do, it's usually more affordable to just buy something new anyway. So why would we go and pay more to repair it? If we had to pay the actual price of any consumer good, we probably wouldn't buy products as often. It's usually cheaper to source materials internationally, transport internationally for production, and then transport internationally for distribution. Have you ever wondered why locally sourced and produced products seemingly cost more than something that was made in, say, China or Vietnam? It might be because, for once, we're paying close to, if not the full price for the materials, labor, and more that went into that product's production and distribution, I guess. So moving on just briefly to consumption. So a lot happens before it ever gets to the store or we pull it up on the internet browser to shop online. And a lot of waste, destruction, and pollution happens outside of our control. As consumers, we're not meant to see these processes or even really think about it. Our purpose in this system is to consume and keep consuming our entire lives. For much of our lives, we've been told that our worth equates to the amount of money in our pocketbook or even the number of items that we own. Do you ever stop to wonder why we are told to consume so much? By the time products get to the store and then to the consumer, the damage has already been done, basically. Not only that, but at the distribution level, more waste is produced without us knowing. Think about the waste stream of a grocery store. We usually only consider the waste that we produce as individuals. So that often comes from product packaging, from things like chips or milk cartons, etc. And while this is still a substantial part of the municipal waste stream, we often don't see the waste behind the scenes of things like individually wrapped pears or plastic wrapped pallets or imperfect product packaging that must be thrown out. So at the consumer level, there's still a substantial amount of waste on the system's side before products even get to us. Moving on to the final part of a linear production model, which is disposal. As consumers, we continue to buy new things in most cases. And in order for that to happen, we need our old stuff to become obsolete, go out of style, become dull, boring in our lives, or maybe break. When that happens, most of us will likely recycle it if we can. Some of us might rehome or repurpose items, but that's not always an option. And so when that's not an option, what do we often do? We throw it in the trash. When we throw something away, we often have this out of sight, out of mind mentality. I know that I can get stuck in that sometimes. And then we roll our bins to the curb, a truck comes up to collect it the next day. We hardly ever even question where that goes or think about what we threw in the bin to begin with. Then we have recycling. Recycling seems like the most eco-conscious, good Samaritan thing to do. Well, it is if recycled materials are actually reused effectively. So let's consider when we recycle a plastic bottle. Plastic is a very commonly recycled item, and we use plastic in a lot of our product packaging. In our idea of recycling, this bottle should then be recycled and turned into a new plastic bottle, repeating this over and over and over again until someone accidentally or spitefully throws it into the trash. While that is idealistic, that is not what actually happens. When plastic is recycled by mechanical means, the materials become weaker every single time. And that means that something like a plastic bottle needs to be downcycled to make something that isn't quite as strong. So plastic bottles usually become things like plastic bags or single-use plastic wrap. This gives them a new life for a short time, but because they're downcycled maybe once or twice, if we're lucky, it will be recycled 2 times, but that's kind of rare in the plastic realm, then it ends up in the landfill. Another example is going back to the electronics example. Electronics recycling is becoming more popular in many major metros, and we would think that this works wonders for the environment, especially because of this planned obsolescence in the electronics industry. Well, unfortunately, many electronic devices that are recycled are sent to other countries, and that recycling stops there. And basically, they extract the valuable pieces and accessible items, and then the rest gets thrown away. I want to back up for a second because I jumped the gun a little bit. What I was explaining with recycling is technically a step outside of a linear production model, and it moves into a reuse system or a reuse production model. And basically, it follows the same process of extraction, production, distribution, consumption, but then in between consumption and disposal, there's recycling that will knock an item back to production in the product's first life, and then it will go through distribution, consumption, and then disposal again, generally in the product's second life, primarily for things like plastics. But for things like aluminum, steel, and glass, if there is glass recycling where you're located, those can actually be reused and recycled an infinite number of times. That's just not true for plastics and paper products. Moving forward, we are going to start exploring a closed loop or circular production model, circular system, circular economy, whatever you want to call it. So both linear and reuse economies or production models are being utilized in various forms all around the world. As we search for a solution, a circular economy often enters this conversation. A circular system or a zero waste system or economy happens when the extraction of resources does not exceed what is necessary and we return what we can, and then everything that we take is continuously reused. For all of the different systems, we start in extraction. But for a circular system, we go from extraction, production, then to distribution, then to consumption, and then we move through reuse, repurpose, return. And the return is really important here because that way we are able to return to some type of extraction because we're giving back to the earth so it can continue to provide. And to make a circular system work, an entire societal and economic shift would need to happen. And that's why there is generally a pretty big pushback from large corporations and some governments, is because this is really hard to do and implement on a large scale quickly. With current globalization, a linear model is ideal. It's easy to do, and it has been working, quote unquote working, at least to make money. The closed loop system, on the other hand, is where more localized systems make sense. So in order to have more of a systemic circular system in place, we would need to lessen our globalization and make things more localized across the board. Luckily, some parts of the world have begun to adopt these circular models. For instance, the Dutch government has a waste-to-resource plan to reach a fully circular economy by 2050, and a bunch of other governments have kind of come up with similar plans in the last few years. And this would mean that they no longer create waste. Now, I want to emphasize that in many circular economies, especially ones that global government systems are putting into place, they often use recycling as a part of that circular economy. So technically they would be in a reuse system, not a circular system. So when companies, governments, etc. are talking about circular systems, it's important to kind of actually read and listen to what they're talking about, because many of them do fall back onto recycling. In either case, these changes are not going to be made overnight, and they cannot really be made all at one time. Most of these changes to move towards zero waste or a circular system are often actually driven by the people more than the government. And I have a couple of good examples of that I want to highlight. So one example is a zero waste grocery store. There are a lot of these in Europe and Canada. Some of them have popped up in some major cities in the United States, like Los Angeles. But one really great example is called NADA, N-A-D-A. And this grocery store is located in Vancouver, British Columbia in Canada, and it produces no waste and uses no packaging for its products. Basically, think of your bulk section at your grocery store, but then apply that to all of your goods. So their goal was to take a broken food supply system and try to make it better. And they proved that it could be done effectively and affordably. So the grocery store NADA reduces waste in the supply chain, provides high quality products at an affordable price for their consumers, and supports a local food security within their city. Another great example of a zero waste system applied in a different way is a zero waste restaurant. So the best example of this that I have seen, and I would love to hear more about it if you've seen other options or other examples, is one located in London, England, called Silo. So this is important because the service industry creates a substantial amount of waste, and it's often not acknowledged or discussed. While it may be noticed by people that work in the industry, it's not necessarily something that we think of when we go to a restaurant or order takeout. So at Silo, they've created a system that relies on a local food supply. So they're getting their food within a certain radius of the city of London. They use only reusable containers and materials, and then they compost what can't be used or any food scraps. If you want to learn more about Silo, which is a very, very interesting restaurant and concept, I will put a link to a YouTube video that talks about basically how they came up with this idea and how they've been able to move through the service industry with these concepts. My third and last example of this is related to the other two and is a bit more general. It's just a basic localized food system. So much of our waste comes from packaging of some kind, generally within food. Local food movements have grown over the last few years and become more commonplace in many communities. Things like farmers markets and even community-supported agriculture, or CSAs, have found their way into larger cities. And honestly, during the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw these systems kind of move into the spotlight because they're able to provide a local food security at really, really uncertain times. So that's probably a lot of information, but I just kind of wanted to overlay how some of those different systems work and provide examples of good things that are also happening, even though so much of our production model is still linear. So to close out this episode, I'm going to go back to what individuals can do in their daily lives. So we can actually continue to push for systemic change through policy change and reaching out to our lawmakers and doing that on a local level, because then you're able to kind of start to implement those localized changes moving forward. And then in our personal daily lives, the easiest way to integrate a closed loop or circular system into your life is to start eliminating some of your food waste. And this can be done really easily through composting. Some major municipalities will pick up food waste and compost it for you. Otherwise, you may need to implement some type of composting system into your household. And there are a ton of really awesome, cool, convenient options. Another thing you can do and can continue to do is to choose to boycott companies that you know exploit workers, resources, etc. for profit. And you can choose not to fall into the trap of impulse buying. So integrating an interruption to your consumption by really taking a step back and rethinking that purpose of that purchase. Essentially, I'm saying you can opt to reduce, reuse, repurpose, and repair as much as possible. Other things that we can do is when you make a new purchase, make sure that you're buying a high quality product and really investing in that thing, whatever that thing is that you are buying. Make sure that it's something that you can repair and it's something that you plan to use sustainably in your own life. You can also choose to support local business initiatives and small businesses, especially ones that are transitioning to a zero waste system. This can be a really, really hard transition, especially if they already had a business model in place. So finding those areas where you can start to support those people trying to make changes in your community, then that's really amazing. In the end, really the best thing that you can do is rethink your daily behaviors. Rethink if you're blindly consuming just because that's the way we've been told to live our entire lives, and start to integrate small changes that can encourage others to change as well. Thanks for listening, and if you like what you hear, let me know. Leave a review and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can find us on Instagram at outdoor.minimalist.book or subscribe to our weekly newsletter at theoutdoorminimalist.com. For even more updates, educational resources, and to help build an outdoor community with the shared goal to create a better outdoor space as we recreate.